So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this next edition of the AISA eTime webinar series. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing or reintroducing to you Ryan Hopkins-Wilcox. Ryan is the Assistant Elementary School Principal at the International School of Kenya. And she is going to talk to us tonight about a concept of learning together around building collaborative partnerships both within schools and across our schools. So Ryan, maybe you can say hi and we'll get started.
Hi, nice to have everyone here. I'm super excited about reaching out and building collaborative partnerships.
Great. So for the folks that are listening, on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a webinar chat box. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can open that by pushing the chat icon. And then throughout the webinar, I invite you to type in comments or questions that you have for Ryan, and we'll do our best to answer those throughout the next hour. So I think we'll get started. So Ryan, I think we know that there's this increasing level of research that supports the idea that individually we can't really make a difference in student achievement if we're working in isolation. So rather we strive to work collectively as teachers and leaders and other adults in the school, parents, students of course, and administrators. And we use that expertise that exists in our schools. And I guess for us in the AISA region, this is particularly important because our educators from time to time, depending on where they are, can feel quite isolated. So because this is the second part of this conversation, maybe you could start by just introducing again this notion of collaborative partnerships. What are they and why are they important for improving student learning?
Great, yeah. Well, I think collaborative partnerships have been an important shift in schools that's happened over the past few decades. Unfortunately, we've known about it for a lot longer than that, as we've known that learners of all kinds are social and cultural meaning makers, and that we do that best together. But it's great that schools are starting to realize that that doesn't just take place for their young learners, but also for their older learners too, their educators and the wider community. I think John Hattie really kind of put it forward for everyone when he did his research into collective teacher efficacy and how that's one of the strongest predictors of student achievement or student learning. And he talks a little bit about how that can happen, and I think it's just great to think about it in our schools. That you said one of the strongest indicators of collective teacher efficacy, or one of the strongest catalysts for it, is just asking teachers to start learning about each other's courses, to open the classroom doors, provide collaborative planning time, maybe create PLCs or professional learning communities. That as we start learning about each other's practices and getting better at identifying problems in our own practice, and looking at solutions together to enhance learning, that it creates a culture of teamwork and a culture of accountability, that teachers really start working together to improve learning for themselves and for their students. I think this increase in professional learning leads to permanent changes in practice, and really builds teachers' capacities in ways that traditional professional development maybe hasn't been as effective in. And with this increased capacity or professional morale, we then get this collective efficacy and a culture of trust in learning together. And the more trust there is, the more teachers are going to want to team and collaborate, and it kind of just becomes this cyclical process that I think really builds a learning organization or a learning community.
How does a collaborative classroom look different to a traditional classroom then? What would we expect to see in a collaborative classroom?
Well, I think we'd expect to see teachers more as researchers, kind of coming in together, looking at the learning. What's working, what's not working, how do we support these students, and then going away with that evidence and that data and really delving into it together trying to just enhance learning for everyone. Because I think as a part of that process, of course, you're focusing on the students and their learning, but you're also then learning how to be a better teacher. I think, you know, traditionally we've done that by ourselves. And even as collaboration came into schools, it was more about planning units instead of looking for the learning. And I think that's going to be a real shift.
So this is a really important point, isn't it? That what we used to do was to, if we were collaborating, we planned together. But now, in fact, we are learning together. And that's a key difference between what we used to do and what we do now. What about your role? As your role as the assistant principal in the elementary school at ISK, then how do you see that role as enhancing or promoting collaborative partnerships or collaborative learning? And maybe you could explain to us what you do and what ISK does in terms of collaborative learning.
Right. So I think that, you know, my role isn't much different than the role of a teacher. I just think it's a changing role for all of us right now as schools and learning is changing. You know, rather than being the resource giver or, you know, the fountain of knowledge, we're now collaborative partners in learning. And so I find my role to be kind of a resource finder, and that resource could be other teachers and helping people find those collaborative partnerships. It could also be connecting them with texts and reading and information that's coming out now. But I don't think that's much different than the teacher. That's what the teacher is doing in the classroom every day, is finding those collaborative partnerships in the classroom for students so that they can learn better together, rather than telling kids things. You know, they're sharing resources so that kids can find out and discover for themselves. And I think that's the role of leadership as well. I'm new to ISK this year, and so that's one thing that I've really been looking at ISK is how can we look at the systems and structures within our school that either hinder collaboration or support it, and then how can we bring more of that in or remove some of those barriers for teachers. And so I think that's the other big role of teachers and leaders everywhere is to remove barriers to learning.
And it would be interesting too, because I would think you would need some sort of formalized structure for this to work. It may work on an ad hoc basis, but for it to be really embedded in the culture of learning in a school, are there certain things that need to be in place? Are there sort of prerequisites or things that schools would need to look at, maybe at an administrative level, or even as peers with fellow educators, to help promote collaborative partnerships within a school that are sustainable and that don't necessarily rely on individuals, which, you know, many a time it can be?
Yeah, I think there's probably like 3 big ingredients that go into having schools that are more of a learning community or a learning organization. I think it's the environment, I think it's leadership, and then I think it's a strong foundation in beliefs and practices around learning. I think you first need the environment that's going to be safe, where people feel like they can learn, that we're open to risk taking, and as a part of that, we're open to the idea of failing and learning from those failures so that we can be better. So rather than that culture of fear, but more of that culture of psychological safety, where different ideas are embraced, there's an openness to innovation, and that there's built-in time for reflection so that we can learn from those risks that we're taking. I think that second part of leadership is also really important. I think schools should think a lot about who they're hiring as leaders, because you want leaders who are really learning leaders, that they model those ideas of lifelong learning. They facilitate the learning of others, kind of like what we've talked about a little bit about being a resource provider, somebody who provokes other people's thinking, kind of is willing to question everything, but again, in that safe way, listens to others and learns together. And then I think all of this is underpinned by a school's philosophy around learning and how those beliefs and practices are lived out every day. I think one of one of the things that you kind of hear in international schools now is a little bit of a change in how different people are approaching teacher appraisal or that process, and kind of looking at a little bit more of teacher growth and teacher learning, and hopefully extending that beyond teachers to leadership and also the wider community. Daniel Pink wrote his book, I don't know, many years ago, probably now, about autonomy, mastery, and purpose in his book Drive. And I think that has a lot that we can learn from in schools, that there's a lot of learning that's happening in the business world that we can bring into schools as we think about these learning organizations, and what do we really believe about learning and how people learn best. And I don't think we learn best in a punitive way, but in a growth way, again, going back to that safe environment for learning.
It's an interesting point you make about, you know, sort of inflicting this idea on people rather than having them embrace it. Do you have any suggestions for folks that are perhaps starting out and want to set up some structures and maybe policies and practices in their schools? You know, very often in international education, in education in general, educators tend to think, oh, not another thing. You know, it's like we just did the last thing. You know, the head of the school or the curriculum coordinator or the principal was, you know, on about something. And how do you sort of avoid having this sense that this is just another thing that they're asking me to do, and that we try to bring people to a realization that we're not making this up. This is actually good practice, and that it's not just another thing. I mean, what suggestions could you give to those that are listening about how we might do that?
I think that sometimes schools choose too many initiatives and do too many things at once, and that becomes overwhelming, and then the learning gets lost in the noise of the multitude. I think schools could narrow it down, a focus, and really follow that one idea for a year. You know, it might be, we really want to increase the idea of inquiry in our classrooms, and we want teachers to be inquirers, we want students to be inquirers, and so that would be your one focus for the year. You know, it could be a year of just reflective practices. What does it mean to be a reflective teacher? What does it mean to be a reflective learner? How do we kind of bring metacognition into this? I think when schools narrow it down and focus on one thing, and then teachers can get on board a little bit, because it doesn't feel so overwhelming. I also think that leadership has a big role in ensuring that one thing is really embedded into everything you do, that it's not just a one-off professional learning experience. It's not, you know, it's a part of the everyday language of the school. And then I think that you can still then allow for teachers to have some choice beyond that. If this is the one thing we're focusing on as a school, and I'm going to make sure that this is the language we're speaking every day, but you really want to learn something else, that you're really focusing on your co-teaching partnership, that's okay, that I think teachers can have those other goals alongside a school goal and inquire into those simultaneously. And then it's just two things. It's not overwhelming. It's not just another thing that we're doing, and it's something that we do every day, so it doesn't feel like a one-off.
It's interesting because your background, of course, is in elementary education, and I wonder whether contextually, is it easier to form collaborative partnerships within elementary school classrooms and maybe, you know, KG and early childhood classrooms than it is in, say, secondary classrooms? I'm thinking of, I always pick on them, it's the high school chemistry teachers. It's like, you know, I have my IB syllabus that I have to get through, and I really don't have time for this. And, you know, I'm not actually really interested in it. And how do you, in these various contexts, sort of promote these collaborative partnerships and collaborative learning, particularly among staff, educators? A very good high school chemistry teacher can certainly promote collaboration within their classroom. But it strikes me, and I'm very much generalizing. So, please, I realize I am generalizing, and I realize I'm picking on chemistry teachers. But it's very much the case that from time to time, because of the demands of the curriculum and all of the pieces that are required, that in high schools, particularly senior high schools, that do you think that it's less likely, or is it more difficult to form these collaborative partnerships?
Yes and no. So having never been a high school teacher, I don't want to speak out of turn too much, but I do think it's as much as you want it to be. And if you choose not to be collaborative, then that's your choice. However, I do think the systems and structures in an elementary school do, as you mentioned, kind of promote that collaborative partnership more readily. In the elementary school, you have, in larger schools, you would have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 teachers working on the same grade level, teaching multitude of subjects. And so coming together all the time to look at those subjects as a team. And that's very much the ethos of an elementary school. Rather, in the high school, you have more of like your subject area focus. And so teachers come together as subject teams, which already is kind of dividing the collaboration a little bit. It's not happening across subjects, but just within a subject. But I do think that we can think creatively beyond that, yes, a subject in high school is very specific. There are a lot of demands for that subject. But what if we just came into each other's classrooms and looked at some different strategies for teaching that work in any subject? Or what if we looked at some of the concepts that are supposed to run across a multitude of subjects? And could we collaborate more on those concepts? Could we bring together 2 very different subjects and have them create a shared unit that might have some of those links across it? So it depends on how we look at those structures and how we can support collaboration.
In a previous life, before I was the executive director here, I used to teach performing arts, and I was at the International School of Tanganyika. And some of the best teaching I think I ever did was the most rewarding teaching, and I think the most impactful teaching was with a group of different arts teachers, the creative arts, the dramatic arts, and the performing arts, the music and dance. And we did exactly that. We made a decision that as a team, we were going to try to see whether we could look at the different elements of what we were doing and see if there was commonality between the different, in that case, the arts subjects. It very quickly, it was in the middle school, so we had the flexibility, I guess, to be able to do that. And very quickly, the social science teachers got on board, and then, some of the language arts teachers got on board, and it just sort of flourished because people tended to realize, well, this is just, a solid practice. Now, I'm dating myself here, but that was back in the early 90s, and it was an amazing experience because what the students then did was to put together these portfolios, which were in fact storybooks. That had songs in them and art, and they were illustrated. And then we took them down to the KG, and our middle school kids then did sort of story time with the kindergarten kids. And so there was a whole different level of interaction there at that level. And I've sort of reflected on that over the years, and I thought, well, it was innovative practice back then, but it was also sort of solid. The thing I regret about it, in a way, is we never wrote it up. It was just something we did. And I wonder now, you mentioned it briefly, teacher as researcher, and this reflection of teaching practice. And if you are doing something, are you monitoring as a group, as a team, what you're doing with others, and whether we have sort of the capacity within our schools as educators to be able to spend time as researchers, whether that's actual research or case study research or however we might do that. Have you had experience in that, and how would you recommend that educators go about that?
Yeah, it's amazing. I went to Reggio, where they teach 3-year-olds, and I think I saw the best teacher research there of anywhere. And I think a lot of people would be surprised that it's the teachers of 3-year-olds who are the real pedagogical researchers, but that's the underpinning of their whole philosophy, is that we watch the students, we observe the learning, we document that learning, and then we come together as collaborative teams and we analyze what that means, how they're interpreting things, what we can do to push them to the next level. And when you start talking about it like that, you realize, well, this can happen in any grade and should be happening in every grade. That teachers should be observing learning and questioning what's working and what's not working, looking for those trends, analyzing patterns, and then coming together with all of that to hypothesize what could be next. How can we take this to the next level? What does this child need in order to go further?
We were touching there a little bit on the context as well. So we spoke about the context within a school. Of course, AISA is a networked collaborative organization. Tell me something about how you see AISA promoting collaborative partnerships across the schools as well. Are there things that, say, I'm coming back to the chemistry teacher, that the chemistry teacher at ISK could work on with other chemistry teachers? And is that a more likely partnership, perhaps, than the chemistry teacher working with the music teacher at ISK?
Yeah, I do think that some of our teachers in our schools feel a little bit isolated because they might be the only chemistry teacher or the only music teacher. And so they don't have a whole lot of people to collaborate with. And so they're put into some of these, what might feel like to them, forced partnerships. So I do think that there's a great opportunity with AISA and our community to allow teachers to collaborate further across schools and to share ideas. Especially with the similarities in learning and international schools. And I know that we're a very diverse community, but I think we're also similarly focused on this idea of students becoming global citizens and being able to interact in their world. And so I think with that kind of shared purpose around all schools, then we can really look at teachers coming together. I think there's several opportunities. The PLIs, or the professional learning institutes, that happen. We send teachers to different countries to learn for 2 or 3 days from a workshop presenter, and I think it's great. And they come back with all these new ideas, but there's a missed opportunity there to also come back with a new network of collaborative partners. And I think as leaders we could enhance that a little bit by offering some other opportunities with those PLIs. So ISK hosts quite a few of them. And I was just thinking, what if people came for the 2 days for the workshop, but stayed for an extra 2 days and did a job alike with the other chemistry teacher? Or maybe we set up a roundtable conversation for leaders that come in. I am the only assistant principal at ISK in the elementary school. And so while I do have collaborative partners of many kinds, there's not another one of me. And so it'd be interesting to talk to other elementary school assistant principals in other schools. So, if I went to a PLI in Cape Town, like where you are right now, could I connect with somebody? And then would that connection be sustainable beyond when we left, just because the world's so much more connected now, and we have Zoom and we have Skype, and we can set up shared drives and folders. So I think there's lots of opportunities. Other things that AISA has are the conferences, which could offer similar kinds of things happening. These webinars that you're hosting are a great chance to kind of see other people from other schools and know who you might want to connect with. I know that there's several publications that we can contribute to, which again, I think helps us find some of those people that we might want to connect with. I think it's then, how do we connect with them, which maybe you can talk a little bit more about your online communities of practice.
Yeah, so several years ago, we set up, I did some research around Etienne Wenger, who has a lot of ideas that were sort of early ideas about these online communities of practice and how they might best function. Following his work, we established at AISA what we call communities of practice. And the way that they were established was really around job role. Previously, at the AISA conferences, we used to have things called job-alikes. We did away with them because they sort of have lost their integrity in a way. It was really they didn't really have a purpose other than, you know, people getting together and socializing. What they needed was some sort of direction and facilitation, and we didn't have the capacity to do that. Once we moved them online, an interesting thing happened, that a topic would be generated by the group that was of need at that time. And there would be a flurry of conversation, and people would offer resources and ideas, and there'd be a lot of communication happening online. After a while, the conversation would die down. And I used to panic about it. I used to think, oh no, they're not working. You know, we need to do more and get facilitators and employ facilitators. And at one point I tried to sort of invent topics that people could talk about just to make sure that they would all keep going. Of course, it wasn't sustainable. There are, you know, well over 40 of these communities of practice online at the moment. Some of them are much more active than others. Some of them we established and there was, you know, one topic of conversation and they've died away. What I'm thinking about now, talking to you, is that we could revamp those to become part of a learning continuum. That when we do a face-to-face event, that we might establish before the learning event, we may not call them online communities anymore, but a collaborative partnership which is online, that flows from a pre-face-to-face event, maybe getting people to think about the topic, you know, do some reading around it, ask some questions. That would help the facilitator of that program then to help plan for the face-to-face event. The conversations and all of the vibrant networking that happens during the face-to-face event then can be continued after it for as long as it's necessary. And I no longer panic when those conversations then phase out for a little while. It's fine, because eventually somebody writes and says, oh, by the way, I'm looking for this, or does anybody have any ideas around that? And they regenerate. The real challenge for AISA with this is the mobility factor, that if you leave those communities for too long, then within 3 or 4 years, you can be sure that, you know, at least half of the people involved have moved on. And so you have all this sort of dead space in the communities that somehow we need to work out. But I like your idea that if we formulate these around specific learning ideas and invite people to participate in that, then I think that's something that AISA could really do quite effectively. And then we would ask the facilitators of those programs who are doing the face-to-face, the PLIs or the conference deep dives or the webinars to continue that conversation online for as long as necessary. And then that, I think, could be a really effective model. So
yeah, I love that. You know, Malcolm Knowles talks a lot about adult learning, and that immediacy is really what hooks adults. I think that all of his theories apply to children as well, but we'll keep going with adults for now. and that, you know, people want to know what they're learning has immediate relevancy and that they can put it into practice tomorrow. And so I think having those strategy groups is kind of what you're talking about a little bit, like a shared purpose around something very specific will provide that immediacy for the groups and hopefully make them more sustaining. But again, like you said, for as long as they need to be. And if they do die out, that's probably okay, because hopefully another one will start.
Yes, and you know, as you know, we're running upwards of 25, 30 PLIs a year, and probably another 20 deep dives at the conference. And so as a result of that, there's a whole lot of conversation, really solid, powerful learning conversations that are happening. And very often the feedback we get from those when we do the evaluations afterwards is, I wish it was longer. I wish I could stay in touch. So this is an idea just waiting to happen in a way. There's another context though, and we spoke about this briefly just before we went on air. We have a whole series of small schools that have really quite unique environments. And I was speaking to you about the idea that at those schools, because the roles of the individuals are multifaceted already, and they can't function effectively unless they have these collaborative partnerships. Because if I'm the head of school, I might also be the operations manager or the business manager or the curriculum coordinator. And if I'm teaching, elementary school, I will certainly be working in a team structure. It could be vertical streaming, horizontal work across different curricular areas. And I wonder whether there's something that we might learn from the innovation that happens in these small schools, and maybe invite them into the conversation as well. I wanted to ask you, have you ever worked in a very small school, or have you had your career in some larger schools?
Yeah, so the first school I worked in was quite small, and we wore a lot of hats. We did a lot of different things. I taught kindergarten, which included me being the PE teacher and the music teacher, as well as the homeroom teacher, and then also a bit of a curriculum coordinator. And you learn so much about how all of these pieces work together in a different way than you learn when you wear just one hat. And I don't think there's rights or wrong to that or anything. Just I guess you learn one job very deeply, or you learn many jobs and how many jobs interact, and why schools so much need collaborative partnerships, that we really should be talking across these positions, so that we can come together with that collective voice and that one idea of a culture within a school.
Is collaboration something you can teach? I mean, if we set up a PLI for you and said, okay, go and teach all these people to be collaborative, is it teachable?
I think it has to be teachable. Collaboration, I think, is a skill. While we're social animals, we don't really learn how to socialize. We follow our role models and things like that, but I do think collaboration is a very unique skill that should be taught. And I think it's overlooked a lot of times, both in our classrooms for our students and for our adult learners. My last principal that I worked with at ISU in Uganda, he had us sit down and do collaborative meetings and made us film ourselves and then rewatch it and look at where collaboration was really strong and where it kind of fell apart, and kind of start picking out some of those skills. And also then some of the essential agreements we needed to make as a team so that we could be more collaborative. And I think it taught us mostly about listening, that you can only collaborate if you hear what the other person is saying.
It's interesting because, some of the schools in the AISA region have sort of formalized this approach to the PLCs. And I'm wondering whether you find there's some comparison to be made between collaborative partnerships and the PLC model.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot that we can learn from the PLC model. I think that what we need as we look, across schools and wider is that is a model that we can learn from, but might not be the only model that works for everybody. And so kind of taking what works for us and then building on that, and learning from what doesn't work and why that doesn't work, and thinking of other ways to do it.
It's interesting because the school I'm thinking of is the school in Addis Ababa, ICS, and I know the head of that school, Tim Stewart. There's some courage required when you want to impress on the whole school community that this is an idea that can work, but we all have to be invested in it. And that meant everybody. The group that I was wondering, I don't know how he handled it, but I'm sure he had a strategy, were the parents. Some parents have this idea, it's an old school idea, that schools should still be very didactic. I will tell you that 1 + 1 = 2, and if in the exam you can tell me that 1 + 1 = 2, I'll give you an A. And of course, international schools have moved, well, we hope they've moved well past that idea. But I know from my own experience that parents sometimes want you to get down to the basics. How do you bring them into this conversation around a methodology or approach to learning that they might think, oh, this is all a little bit airy-fairy and I don't quite know how this is, an effective way for my child to get into university. Have you got strategies for involving parents in the conversation?
I really think it's about that learning together, that those collaborative partnerships extend far beyond just our teachers and the educators within a school, that we need to be looking at the whole community. I think there's a lot we can learn from our parent community, and I think there's a lot they can learn from us. And so I think bringing these two groups together to learn together is crucial. And when you can have that happen, then I think you can have some of those ideas starting to shift, I think, for both sides. I'll quote Reggio again, but Malaguzzi calls the parents the child's first teacher. And I think that is so important for us to remember, is that the parents are the child's first teacher, and they spent formative years with those kids and continue throughout their lives. And teachers come in for a year and then leave. So what can we learn from the parents about these children that we're teaching that will be so important to help us in our work? But then also, how can we share what we're doing and help parents kind of see the relevance in it? They didn't go to school like we did to learn about education. So it's a massive job. Like, some of us, went for a 4-year degree, others have masters and doctorates added upon that. So how do you cram, 4 to 8 years of professional learning into a few sessions with parents? And I think that's what schools try to do, is say, well, once a month we'll invite parents in and we'll host a parent evening. And I don't think that's enough. I think we really need to be reaching out more often, inviting parents in more often. But I think first we need to go back to that environment piece, and that we have that safe environment, that trusting environment. We need to build that, because we want parents to come in. We want teachers to want parents to come in. We want leaders to want parents to come in. And that's only going to happen if we trust that we're all going to be learning from this and not judging each other from this.
Yes, I was laughing because I travel a lot, and to visit schools across the region. And one of the things that I often hear is that, well, somehow we prefer it when the parents drop their kids at the gate, and we don't want clusters of parents, coming onto the campus. Other schools really welcome it, and they actually establish quite lovely opportunities for parents to meet each other, but also to be involved in the school day. So some see it as a distraction, others see it as being an integrated part of, this sort of collaborative learning approach. And I've seen schools also that actually use the actual expertise of parents within the classroom. And I'm not thinking, or bring dad to work day sort of thing. It's not that. It's well past that, well beyond that in terms of its efficacy and inclusion. Something else that we've been looking at in the AISA region is this notion of personalized learning, and how blended learning strategies can really help promote that. From our point of view within this region, and within many parts of the world now, there's a very practical side to this, which is around the fact that our schools need to have plans in place should they need to close in an emergency. So the blended learning approach and can really help with that. But I've often said to schools that it can't be a fire drill approach. It can't be something that you say, okay, well, we're heading to the airport and I'm trying to put PDFs of worksheets up online somewhere on the Google Drive so that kids can access them and continue their learning. It's just, not tenable to think that that's effective learning. So what we've been looking at is ways in which we can help schools to embed a culture of personalized learning through the use of appropriate technology in these quality blended learning models. It strikes me from the conversation we've been having that would also really be a mechanism by which these collaborative partnerships and collaborative approaches to learning could take place, and in fact involve parents. because parents may not have the time to come to the school and participate in their child's learning in that way. But there would certainly be a possibility that they could be involved in these online modes of learning in whatever way we can see fit. Have you ever sort of thought about the idea of having collaborative partnerships that go online in terms of blended learning and the possibilities that that might bring?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that before, but I love the idea. I think you've kind of really hit the nail on the head with this idea that you know, like in universal design for learning, what's good for one is good for all. And so if we're developing these blended learning platforms in schools for our students, why not take that to our larger community and really embrace the idea that we are all learners and that we can all learn together using some of these similar strategies, obviously tailored in different ways to the different audiences. But I think that could be great. I think, you know, educators are already looking for this. You see so many people reaching out on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and these different social media platforms, that if we could formalize that a little bit more and kind of bring those people together in a blended learning platform, I think that could be a great opportunity for everybody.
Yeah, it could happen at different levels, couldn't it? It could be in terms of student learning, but it could also be in terms of professional learning for the adults and bring those folks together. I think we touched on it when we were talking about these online communities of practice, but there's a lot of scope there. One of the educators at Lincoln School in Ghana, before he left, Ryan Harwood, used to run what we called a slow chat. And periodically he would ask 4 questions that educators could answer over the period of a whole day. And so people would sort of come in when they had time, and I used to read them and think these are really fine reflections, but they're on Twitter. You know, so nobody has the time to be, you know, getting into the details, but because they're on Twitter, you have to really think about what it is that I want to say within that space, that limited space, that is meaningful and authentic, but also very engaging and engaging with others. So you're absolutely right. I think there's great potential here. Lami is asking a question. He's asking, we may have sort of touched on this. He's asking, how often can parents go into a school for collaborations? Is there a limit? I guess most schools, as I said, you know, might determine that. At ISK, do you encourage parents to come into classrooms, and how often, or is it more formalized?
It's more formalized, but you know, I think every school is on a journey, and it depends on where that school is going with that journey. You know, I've been at other schools where they've really embraced that collaborative partnership with parents, but it's been a slow process. Like I said, you have to establish those levels of trust so that teachers want parents in their classrooms, and that takes time. And I think it starts with leadership, inviting parents in and helping parents start to understand the ethos of a school, the philosophy of learning at the school. And once you get parents kind of on board with that, and you know, they've embraced it themselves, and they're now curious, well, how do you do this? How do you live this philosophy of learning? Then, you know, maybe start small and say, well, you know, why don't we do an open day twice a year, and parents can come in for that. Maybe we do an evening event. As you've now suggested, we could do some online learning. But then, you know, eventually if the partnership is really working out for both parties, then it could extend to having, instead of, you know, assembly times, maybe parents come in and join the classrooms and be a part of it. Instead of having exhibitions of learning, maybe it's more of coming again into the classroom, having the kids explain what they're doing. I think a lot of schools are already thinking about this with a shift towards student-led conferences and things like that. And so I don't think there is a limit to it. I think it just depends on your level of comfortability and how well you build those partnerships and that trust.
And perhaps something you said before was there isn't one size fits all. So it might be that, I'm going to talk about him again, The chemistry teacher might not be comfortable, and it might not even, in terms of health and safety, might not even be allowable to have parents wandering into the chemistry classroom. But there might be other opportunities there where those collaborations could take place, and I think it's a really intriguing thing to explore it within the comfort level of each of the individuals within the school. Just a note for those listening that you can type in questions into the chat box if you have any, and we'll do our best to get to them. We're sort of about 10 minutes out. The other piece I wanted to ask you about was around it's around the contextual piece. This question of mobility, you mentioned it earlier on, and I wanted to touch on it again. If schools are trying to embed this culture of collaborative learning within their system at a systems level, we know that international schools, both in terms of the educators, the administrators, the students, and their parents, are highly mobile, more mobile than perhaps any other school system. And I just wonder, how is it that we could encourage schools to create a culture of collaboration and collaborative partnerships, rather than relying on individuals, say like yourself, who have a keen interest in it. I'm sure the work you've done in other schools is there, but I don't know whether you've ever checked. Have you ever sort of gone back and said, oh wow, that all fell apart quickly?
Yeah, and I think that's so true. It can depend so much on the person, which is why I think it's so important for schools to really think through that philosophy of learning, those beliefs and practices, and have that solidly in place. Because then it becomes your standards and practices as a school, and it's not up to one person to decide if this is who we want to be. This is who we are, and we hire people then based on, well, do you think you're a good fit for this? And how are you going to enhance this? And people can then make very educated decisions of, no, actually, I don't think that school is great for me. I might go to a different one. And I think in that way, we can have more of this institutional memory, just with those documents in place. I think, some people think that policies is a bad word, but I think it's the foundation of a good school, and it's what we can turn back to. It's what keeps us from being a suitcase school with teachers coming in with different ideas from all over, which are all great ideas. Everyone comes with amazing resources to share, but how do we decide which ones of those fit with this school? And then how do we say no to the extraneous ones? And when you have a good policy in place, when you have those standards and practices for your school, then you don't have to be the one who says that. You can just kind of turn to that and say, well, actually, this isn't really what we do here. And so if we want collaboration to be one of those integral parts of who we are as a school or an organization, that should be solidly written in, and it should be a practice that we follow every day with our actions and behaviors.
Yeah, excellent. It's excellent advice. I couldn't agree more. And again, in my role, I see it happen that as heads of schools, but also principals, even curriculum coordinators, as they move in and out. I've been in my job for 10 years, and I've seen a lot of heads in schools and curriculum coordinators move in and out of our schools. And it's astounding to me that the roller coaster ride that some schools go on as that happens, and it's precisely because of the reasons you're suggesting, is that some of the ideas that are there are perhaps a bit tenuous, but they've not been written into policy, or I guess more specifically into the strategic plan. And if they're not in a school strategic plan, then it's very difficult to justify the resources that need to go into them in order to make them sustainable. So, Ryan, I think that is great advice that you're offering. And I guess we would encourage schools that do want to go down this pathway is to start there and to look at, well, strategically, do we want to become this type of school, and how will that help us to fulfill our school's mission and vision, and really to make it that at that strategic level for it to be successful. Great. Well, it was Lummy has a question. He wants to know whether the recording will be available. Yes, it will be, Lummy. It'll go up on the AISA website. Again, to people listening, if you have questions, you've only got a few minutes left to put those questions forward. Ryan, I guess we're sort of wrapping up. Was there anything that you wanted to cover that we haven't yet in the remaining few minutes?
I guess, you know, maybe how are we going to do this?
Yeah.
And maybe that's not a question we can answer in just a few minutes, but I hope that you and I and whoever else would like to join us could look at establishing our own collaborative partnership and creating something going forward that other people can join and we can extend beyond just this conversation.
Could I suggest that we put in practice what we've been talking about and that AISA might set up what we're currently calling these online communities of practice, but certainly an online discussion forum that would help us explore some of these ideas a little more. We could begin by all the people that are involved and have registered for this webinar. We'll send them invitations and we hope that they'll accept them. But then perhaps more widely for those that couldn't attend, we'll put out a message to all our educators. We have quite a lot of them on our database, inviting them to come and participate. And then I'm sure probably you and Graham will be able to design some really effective learning strategies for those learners, adult learners, in terms of adopting some of the principles that we've been talking about. And I think that would be great.
Yeah, I'd be so excited to learn beyond just ISK. You kind of mentioned the transient community a little bit, and I think, you know, yes, that makes some things hard to do and keep in place, but I also think it's a huge benefit to us. You know, I know I did just move next door, so it's a little bit different, but I now have a whole bank of resources in Uganda that I can pull from while I'm in Kenya, and vice versa. I hope that I can be a resource to those that I left in Uganda. And, you know, as other people move, and I have now former colleagues who are working in Ethiopia and in Tanzania, that, you know, it just kind of continues to spread and become where AISA is a resource for us all.
Yeah, great. And we have had precedent on that as well. When we started working in the service learning domain a few years ago, and that just took off across the region, and we were able to become sort of a hub of thinking around that. Similarly, of course, with child protection, we were able to become a hub for schools to really promote child protection. So we certainly have the capacity and, quite frankly, the desire to support schools that are interested in going down this path. Lami's asked another really interesting question. I don't know whether you saw it, whether the online community could include students. Now, we've been talking about collaboration across different spectrums at schools. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think, you know, like what we've been talking about a little bit is that you know, we should be learning just as much from our students as they're learning from us. And so including students in some of these discussions, I think, would be so beneficial all the way around. Right now at ISK, we're kind of looking at our schedule in the elementary school and what's working and what's not working and how could we reimagine it next year. And that's exactly what we started talking about today is, why are we the only ones making this decision? Where is the student voice in this? So yeah, I think online communities could definitely involve students.
Yeah, and again, to cite what I've observed from schools that are successful or perhaps more successful, that student agency, that piece, that when schools adopt and promote student agency within the entire school strategy, and they are really highly successful when they do that, because otherwise what are people thinking about? You know, it's like I'm the educator and I'm thinking about my needs. That's counterintuitive, isn't it? You're an educator, you need to be focusing on the needs of your students, and how can you do that if you don't ever hear from them? So it doesn't make sense.
Great. I guess that skill of collaboration is really grounded in listening.
Yes. And, you know, I've seen, well, we know from our service learning work that when you allow students to have a voice and to have agency, particularly around service work, it is phenomenal. We have students involved in things that I would never have thought possible. And certainly when I went to school, I would never have had the wherewithal in terms of my own thinking to be able to even envisage. And when you see what they're able to do, it is really extraordinary. And why wouldn't you invite that level of discourse with students and get their input? Ryan, I'm going to draw it to a close. Unless anyone else has a quick question you want to put into the chat box, I'd like to really thank you. I've enjoyed it. I hope everybody else has as well. I've learned a lot, actually. You've given me some ideas to go back to AISA and within our organization to try and promote collaborative partnerships. I look forward to working with you and anyone else who is interested in trying to move this idea forward. So any last words from you?
No, just thank you so much for this opportunity, and I really look forward to collaborating with you.
Great. Thanks, Ryan, and thanks, everyone.